Hey guys, John Mark Wheeler here, born and raised in North Carolina, and for the past 6 years I've been with Youth with a Mission in Kona, Hawaii, and I wanted to share with you a little bit about my testimony and how I got involved in full-time missions for the past 8 years now. Growing up, I lived in a Christian home. My dad's a pastor, and I can remember being about 3 or 4 years old and being in church, sitting on the front row, and my mom would always divide my brother and I because we would always just talk with each other. And one day, my brother leans over to my mom and starts saying something, and I was super curious because we weren't really allowed to talk in church. And my mom started talking back to him, and usually she doesn't do that unless she's reprimanding him. But that particular day, she kind of laughed at my brother, and I was super curious. So I kind of forgot about it after church. But later that night, I asked my mom, "What was it that you were talking to Patrick about?" Who's my brother. And she said, "Patrick asked if you had Jesus in your heart." And I can remember being about 4 years old wondering, what do you mean? Of course I have Jesus in my heart. I just assumed that anybody who went to church and loved the Lord had Jesus already in their heart. And she explained that you had to invite him in. And so I can remember being 4 years old on my brother's bed late at night, listening to the bedtime stories, inviting in Jesus for the first time. And for the next few years, being able to grow up in the church was a really awesome and amazing thing for me. But in my teenage years, I was met with that reality of, am I going to make God my own? Or if I'm going to continue to just live my life under the shadow of my parents and their faith. And so I struggled a lot with that identity. And in my teenage years, I really got sidetracked and started living for the world. I was homeschooled until I was in 8th grade, and I remember going to 8th grade and being really confident in who I was. I loved skateboarding, and at the time they didn't have like stretchy jeans, so I would wear girl jeans because it just flexed better for skateboarding. And I remember going into 8th grade at this public school and having everybody kind of question who I was. And they questioned my name, being John Mark, 2 names in one, and they thought it was a little weird that I had 2 names, and there was this clash of reality that hit me. That was like, who I am doesn't necessarily measure up, and so I started to change and adapt to what I thought people wanted. And so I started going by John, I started dressing differently, I started trying to hang out with a different type of crowd of friends, and that continued to lead all the way through high school and into college. That identity that kind of shifted when I was in 8th grade to be worldly continued on through all those years in my academics and the people that I surrounded myself with, where I started getting into drugs and I started doing cocaine and smoking marijuana and being heavily into alcohol and just finding myself in some really gnarly situations. And the only thing I knew that I really wanted in life was to become a cardiologist. And so I just kept pursuing the medical field. And I remember one day driving home from college, going into my last year of college, God took away my passion for the medical field. And I can say that confidently now, but I didn't know what it was at the time. And I was left with this emptiness in me that reminded me that I didn't really know what my identity was. I really didn't know why I was on this earth and what I was living for. I thought that I had understood it because I had made my own mind of what I wanted to do. But when that was taken away from me, I realized I really didn't know who I was and what I was living for. So my parents asked me if I'd ever thought about doing missions. And at that time, I really didn't think too much about missions. And honestly, at that time, again, just really didn't have a good, solid understanding of relationship with Jesus. But I spent the next 7 days looking completely into YWAM. And I looked at every base around the entire world because I have this desire in my heart to say, Jesus, if you're really real and you're really relationship oriented, then I'm going to give you everything that I have if you show up. So I spent the next 7 days looking in and waiting for him to speak to me. And if he had spoken to me about a place to go and do a discipleship training school, I would go. I honestly didn't really think that he would speak, but on the 7th day he spoke to me and told me that I should go to Destination Paradise in Belize. I remember going through and writing down on this piece of paper, I still have the piece of paper, and I was writing down all these places that I thought would be kind of fun, like, oh cool, Australia. I always thought Australia would be a fun place because I was a big fan of Crocodile Hunter, and I always, I just was like, man, this would be amazing to go to some of these cool places that I've never been before. At that point, I really hadn't been anywhere, so that would have probably been anywhere. And I just remember going onto the page that just had all the names listed out, and they're all in red. And at that time I was really ignorant with the world. I didn't know where places really were. And I remember clicking on Belize. And when I clicked on Belize, I didn't know where that was at all. And as the page was loading, I just remember like this deep understanding in my heart that God was speaking to me. And he said, John Mark, that is where you're going to go and do your discipleship training school. There was like a depth of desire that came along with the ask. And it was like the voice in my head sounded just like me, but it was like, you can go here. And there was like this recognition of like, I want to go here. And I can't, it's hard to explain, but I knew instantly that it wasn't my thought, and it wasn't my desire, because I didn't even know what Belize was or where it was or what it entailed. And so the fact that as it was loading, that there was this voice in me that again sounded just like my own voice in my mind, but there was like a welcome invitation. And I had made this thought in my mind that if God ever speaks to me, that I would say yes without hesitation. And so while the page was loading, I can remember sitting in my chair in Alabama and just saying, okay, God, I'm going to go here. And then as the page loaded, it was everything that I ever really wanted. It was like right on the beach, right in like this island paradise on the second greatest barrier reef in the world, scuba diving, snorkeling, spearfishing, sailing. And it was like God was reminding me of this reality that I've held true to for the past few years, that when we walk in obedience to what God asks us, he gives us blessing. And it's not always monetary, it's not always location, but it's his presence and his nearness to our hearts. And he knows the desires that we have. And so when I said yes to him to go to Belize, it was like opening this gift that was perfectly created for the desires of my heart, with being on the beach and all the things that came along with it, scuba diving and snorkeling and spearfishing. Belize is a very interesting place. So where I was at in Belize was on this island. And when we flew into Belize, we took this little, call it like a crop duster plane, over to the islands, and then we landed. We got on this boat ferry. It was like a water taxi. It was about a 10-15 minute boat ride from like downtown to our base. And I can remember just the first time going on this boat ride being like, this is so wild. Like, I'm in this country that is gorgeous, riding on this boat taxi to our base, where I'm going to be living on the beach of Belize for the next 3 months. And had really no idea what to expect, other than expectancy that I'm going to encounter God, whatever that meant. I didn't really know, because I hadn't experienced it really before. Even growing up in the church, you know, if you have grown up in the church and you haven't really had a real relationship with God, you know that you're banking off of other people's understandings of who God is. And I think that was for me. I just rode the coattails of people around me, and I didn't have a real deep understanding. And so as I was riding on this boat ride, I was just excited for whatever it was. And I remember stepping foot onto the dock that went out over the water. And I stepped foot, and it was like God's presence met me there. And I remember getting on that boat, off the boat onto the dock, and just thinking like, I will never be the same again. Like, this is about to change my life. I didn't even know what I was thinking or what I was saying, and I couldn't believe the reality that ended up happening by the time I left 3 months later, that that's exactly what happened. But there was something in my heart and my desire to meet and encounter God where he equally desired the same thing. And so I just remember that moment of being like, wow, this is going to change me. And I remember being in Belize, understanding my identity in Christ. Everything started to come into focus. And I remember sitting on the beach saying to the Lord, you can have everything that I am, and I will follow you forever. One of my biggest desires when I went to do a DTS, before it was even like for the Lord, was to be able to travel the entire world. And since I've been able to walk really in tune with God, I've been able to travel to 64 nations over the past 8 years, which is wild and radical to think that like my simple yes has led me to so many places. So after I did my Bible school, I ended up going to Kona, Hawaii, where I've been for the past 6 years, which led me to Australia to get on a medical ship and come full circle back around. I left my identity in the medical field so that I could gain my identity in Jesus. And then 3 years later, God brought me back to a place where I was able to be the medical coordinator for all of our medical outreaches in Papua New Guinea for a year, where I was able to help lead and direct the doctors and nurses and surgeons who would come in to do eye surgeries for the patients in the islands of the Pacific and Papua New Guinea. And to be able to see, the eye surgeries for the cataract patients, to see dentistry for those who had toothaches, who needed teeth pulled, and to be able to see immunizations for babies. We live in a world, in the Western world, where diseases through vaccines are pretty much eradicated, but people are still dying every day of very simple things in the third world. And to be able to come in and share that simple vaccine or the simple medication that would save generation from dying was unbelievable. And so it's just been crazy to see how God is committed to my whole life and in every area. And when I was out there for a year, I actually ended up meeting my wife, who was leading a team from Kona, and we've been married now for 4 years. And it's just been such an incredible journey of being able to see God continue to show up in my heart and my desires.